They didn't get a childhood, not the kind we think of. No toys scattered on the floor, no long days of school, no cartoons or birthdays or weekends. Childhood in ancient Egypt was short, hot, and full of responsibility. You were expected to grow up fast, and if you didn't, life made sure you did. Most children didn't get the luxury of innocence. They were born into a world that treated them as soon-to-be workers, and sometimes as small-scale adults in training. Before we go further, make yourself comfortable. And if you're enjoying this journey through forgotten corners of history, consider subscribing. It helps more than you know. Drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see how far this quiet little world reaches. Most kids didn't go to school. They worked. In the fields, in workshops, at home, copying their parents, picking up the tools of survival as soon as they could walk. Some carried water from the river in clay jars almost as big as they were. Others ground grain using stone querns, a slow, back-breaking job that left their arms sore and hands calloused. Some were put to work weaving reeds into mats or baskets, or chasing birds and pests from the crops under the blazing sun. The Nile may have fed the land, but it didn't give days off. If you were lucky, very lucky, you were born into a scribe's family or the priesthood. That meant education. But education wasn't gentle. Boys were taught by repetition, by discipline, and by long hours hunched over wooden boards, scribbling symbols with reed pens dipped in ink. Literacy was rare and valuable, but the path to it was long and harsh. Girls, meanwhile, were mostly trained at home, expected to master domestic skills early, managing household duties, and eventually raising children of their own. There were toys, technically. Carved wooden animals, spinning tops, little clay dolls with movable limbs. But these weren't comforts. They were temporary distractions, often made from scraps, sometimes carved by older siblings. Play was squeezed into the narrow spaces between labor. Even games reflected life. Toy boats for navigating the river, mock hunting tools, tiny furniture. These weren't fantasies. They were training sets. And always, there was the heat. Children walked barefoot on burning ground, shoulders pink from the sun. They had little protection, no shoes unless you were elite, no formal childcare, and very few breaks. Illness was common. Cuts got infected. Parasites lived in the water. Many children never made it past the age of 5. We'll keep going tomorrow. But for now, imagine this. The sun just rising over the Nile, casting golden light on a village waking up. And somewhere, a 5-year-old is already hauling water, barefoot, teeth gritted, trying not to spill a drop. That's how childhood began, and for many, how it stayed. There was no such thing as privacy. A child's world was small, just a few rooms of mud brick, shared with siblings, cousins, and often livestock. Homes were open, crowded, and full of noise. Crying babies, grinding querns, flapping geese, shouting adults. There were no bedrooms, no doors to close. Even sleep came communally, on mats, laid out wherever there was space. You slept where you could, when you could, and sometimes not at all. Children learned to be quiet before they learned to speak clearly. Too much noise could bring punishment. Too little movement could be seen as laziness. There was no room for sulking or tantrums. Emotions were watched. Expectations were set early. Discipline came in the form of words, hands, or silence. It was woven into language, ritual, and rhythm. You were praised for being obedient, punished for stepping out of line, and ignored if you asked too many questions. There was a place for everything, even feelings, and usually that place was quiet. Illness, too, was a part of daily life. Children were vulnerable, always. Their small bodies were targets for heat, parasites, infections. There were amulets meant to protect them, spells and charms, incantations written on scraps of linen. Mothers whispered prayers while tying beads to wrists. But magic wasn't always enough. Diarrhea, fever, cough, rashes, these were just parts of growing up. The river brought life, but also disease. Mosquitoes, worms, contaminated water. Some survived, many didn't, and it was rare to meet an adult who hadn't lost a sibling. Death wasn't shocking, it was expected. Even the rituals around death were shaped by this normalcy. A small burial, maybe a few offerings. If you were poor, not even that. Grief was folded into routine. There was no room for prolonged mourning, no luxury for emotional collapse. The work still had to be done. Fields still needed tending. Water still needed to be hauled. And children, even in their grief, were expected to continue. Still, childhood wasn't joyless. There were stories told at night, sometimes by candlelight, sometimes by memory alone. Tales of gods and monsters, animals that talked, heroes who survived crocodile bites and angry spirits. Songs passed down across generations, sung softly to babies, swaddled in reed baskets. Games played in the dust with lines scratched by fingers, little challenges with pebbles, shells, bits of broken pottery. Laughter happened, even in hunger. It was small and fast, and often silenced quickly when chores resumed. But it was real, and that laughter was shaped by limits. No one dreamed of becoming something else. You became your parents. You inherited their tools, their work, their expectations. There was no room for imagining another life, just learning how to survive the one you had. You were not raised for joy. You were raised to endure. Some were born lucky, not safe, not free, but lucky. Children of officials, scribes, or priests had better roofs, better food, and sometimes access to education. But even privilege came with pressure. The expectations were heavier, more rigid. You weren't nurtured so much as molded. Your life path was mapped out the moment you could sit still, and there wasn't much room to question it. Everything was preparation. Your name, your posture, your handwriting, your silence. It all had to reflect your family's reputation. Scribe families trained their children with harsh repetition. Writing wasn't just a skill. It was a discipline, a lifestyle, a path to stability, and a test of endurance. Boys sat cross-legged on hard floors, scratching symbols into wooden boards with reed pens for hours on end. The ink was made from soot and water, and the boards were reused until the wood wore thin. Lessons were memorized, not discussed. Hours passed in silence except for the scrape of pens and the occasional correction barked out by a teacher or parent. Mistakes weren't just errors. They were seen as moral failings. Some children thrived in that structure, bending their minds to the shapes of hieroglyphs and temple phrases. Others quietly broke under it, their futures dimming word by word, stroke by stroke. The pressure wasn't just academic, it was social. Failure meant shame. Girls in wealthier homes were expected to master the private world. That meant accounting for food stores, overseeing servants, managing clothing, and preparing for marriage as early as adolescence. The richer the home, the more layers of duty. Girls were taught to represent their families with grace, obedience, and silence. Few decisions were theirs to make. Their futures weren't imagined. They were arranged. Marriage wasn't a milestone. It was a transaction. And after marriage, the expectations only multiplied. Fertility, loyalty, and competence. Being a child in a wealthy home was a short-lived position. You became a caretaker before your own body had finished growing. And even with wealth, danger remained. Disease didn't care how many amulets you wore. Floods didn't skip estates. Accidents didn't respect social class. High rank couldn't protect a child from a fever that came in the night or a fall into the river. In paintings, noble children are shown with shaven heads, one long sidelock of hair, lotus blossoms in hand, and carefully painted eyes. They're pictured as serene, miniature adults. But the reality behind those portraits was much more fragile. The paint hid the risks, the pressure, and the silence. These were curated images meant to signal order, not truth. Behind every pose was a child under constant watch. They were taught to behave like adults, composed, efficient, respectful. They memorized lines for temple rituals, stood still during ceremonies, and watched their parents navigate the politics of favor and obligation. They learned early that being seen too much or saying the wrong thing could reflect poorly on their entire household. You learned to speak carefully, move deliberately, and never draw attention to weakness. Even laughter had to be measured. Even kindness was strategic. They weren't immune to fear. They just weren't allowed to show it. The fear of disappointing a father, of shaming a lineage, of failing in front of guests. It all pressed inward, and there wasn't space to talk about it. Emotional fluency wasn't part of the curriculum. But at the end of the day, they were still children, quietly carrying the weight of family legacy on small shoulders. There were no tantrums, no rebellion. There was only training, silence, and expectation. A childhood of glances and gestures, not freedom. Even small joys had to be quiet. A treat of figs, a cool spot in the shade, a nod of approval from a stern parent. Even the lucky ones lived under pressure. Childhood wasn't an escape. It was an apprenticeship in survival, performance, and duty, with no room for dreaming and no space to be unsure. For them, luck just meant the walls were stronger. The silence was softer, but the rules were the same. Hunger was a constant, not the sharp, dramatic hunger of famine, but the slow, steady kind, the kind that settled into your bones and stayed there, reshaping your idea of comfort. Most children didn't eat 3 meals a day. Some barely got 2. Breakfast was often a piece of coarse bread and a sip of sour beer, more bitter than filling. Dinner might be lentils, onions, or whatever could be foraged or traded at the last moment. There were no snacks, no choices. Just the hope that something warm was left in the pot. The bread was hard, made from grain ground with sand and grit. Every bite wore your teeth down, scraped enamel away, left gums raw. Children chewed through it anyway because there was no choice. You ate or you went without. If the family had a goat, or if someone managed to catch fish from the canals, protein was a rare luxury, a moment of relief in a routine of repetition. Most days, food wasn't satisfying. It didn't comfort. It just filled space. And even that space was not always guaranteed. If the Nile flooded too little or too much, crops failed. Silos went half empty, or were guarded tightly. Mothers skipped meals so their children could eat. Older kids gave up portions for younger siblings, a quiet sacrifice no one talked about. Hunger didn't shout. It whispered, day after day. It showed up in thin limbs, shallow breathing, eyes that stopped shining so early. It wasn't just the body that suffered. Hunger changed how you saw everything. Children learned to watch the adults' faces for clues. A furrowed brow might mean another skipped meal. A quiet conversation meant rations would stretch thinner. Meals shrank as the flood receded. You didn't ask when food was coming. You waited, and you hoped. And if someone offered you a crust, you took it with both hands, grateful and silent. In richer households, children ate better. They had dates, honey, roasted meat, sweet cakes with dried fruits. But those were the children of scribes, priests, merchants, families with grain to spare, with power. They were few. Most children never tasted sweetness, never saw more than one kind of fruit, never felt full unless it was a festival or a harvest celebration. And even then, you learned not to expect too much. Hunger had a way of teaching children exactly what they could live without. There was no reward for complaining. No one asked what you wanted. You ate what there was, whether you liked it or not. You learned quickly not to ask for more. That kind of lesson lasted a lifetime. And later, Even if you grew up and found a better meal, you still chewed like you might have to share it. You still saved the last bite. Because part of you remembered being small and hungry, and no one saying a word about it. There was no real preparation for adulthood. You didn't grow into it. You collided with it. One day you were chasing chickens around the courtyard. The next you were handed a tool, a task, or a child to care for. The transition didn't come with a celebration or a conversation. It wasn't marked by candles or gifts. It came like sunrise, slow, silent, and impossible to stop. You were small. Then, suddenly you weren't. You were expected to take your place in the rhythm of labor without protest, without hesitation. Most children were absorbed into adult roles by the time they reached their early teens, often earlier. Boys began shadowing their fathers, mimicking the grip of a tool, learning to barter, to repair, to endure. Girls watched their mothers grind grain, tend fires, patch clothes, soothe siblings. These were not just chores. They were rehearsals. They signaled that the world would expect something of you soon. Marriage wasn't a question of if, but when. Labor wasn't delayed. It was inherited. Puberty didn't mean self-expression. It meant stricter rules. For girls, it meant modesty, responsibility, and expectation. Managing the household wasn't just about food. It was about survival. You had to know how to stretch a small supply of flour, how to store water, how to soothe a fever when medicine was mostly prayer. For boys, it could mean back-breaking work, early injuries, sunburns that scarred. You might fish in crocodile-filled waters or haul stones so heavy they could split a shoulder. Education, if it came, was not a break from this. It was an additional weight, learning to write, to chant, to obey, to make fewer mistakes, faster. There were no gap years, no freedom to roam, to question, to wonder who you wanted to become. You became what the world expected, and quickly. Identity wasn't chosen, it was absorbed. You became a younger version of your parents, shaped not by dreams, but by repetition. You were what you did, and what you did was rarely new. Failure wasn't an option, because failure was costly. If you fell behind in your duties, you weren't just scolded. You risked the rhythm of the household. You might be pulled aside, shamed in front of others, or quietly punished. Sometimes you were hit. Sometimes you were ignored. But always, you were corrected. Correction wasn't cruelty. It was seen as necessity. It was a reminder that softness had an expiration date. The hands that once carried you were now there to mold you, sometimes harshly. The shift was gradual, but it settled deep. Games faded. Tasks multiplied. You were left out of play, pulled into plans, absorbed into duties. Your voice deepened, and your presence was counted not as a child, but as a contributor. You learned to watch more than speak, to anticipate what was needed, to endure without recognition, to find small pockets of joy in the in-between moments, before sunrise, after chores, in a shared glance or quiet meal. To be a child in ancient Egypt was to grow up fast and without pause. You didn't ease into responsibility. You were handed it, whether your hands were ready or not. And from that point on, you carried it. Every day, without complaint, because that's what was expected, because that's what everyone else had done. There was no protection from boredom, not the idle kind born of luxury, but the slow, grinding repetition of a life with no variation. A child's day in ancient Egypt unfolded with unrelenting sameness. Wake to the same sun, follow the same routine, haul the same water, return to the same mat at night, exhausted and dusty, only to do it all over again the next day. Time wasn't marked by change, but by cycles. The same seasons, the same rituals, the same expectations. The days blurred. Nothing was unexpected. Chores always came first. Before play, before rest. Each morning, Fires needed to be stoked, water fetched from the river, animals checked or herded. Children swept courtyards, gathered fuel, washed bowls, and sometimes helped knead bread or spin thread. Some followed goats or geese across dry, cracking fields. Others stood for hours beside still water, waiting with nets for fish that may never come. Their small hands ached, their backs tired before midday. There were no weekends, no breaks, and even after tasks were completed, more would appear, mending, weaving, shelling beans, cleaning clothes in muddy water. Every job repeated, every job expected. The only interruption in the endless routine was the calendar of religious life. But even that wasn't rest. Festivals, temple processions, and offerings to gods like Hathor or Khonsu brought more tasks. You didn't play at a festival. You performed. You carried things, cleaned things, stood still while incense burned. You watched the adults and tried not to fidget. The drums were loud, the crowds dense, and still, you were expected to stay in line, to smile, to listen, to behave. In the sacred spaces, children were workers, not celebrants. Stories helped. If the work was done, and the fire still flickered, someone might share a tale. About spirits who wandered the desert in animal form, about crocodiles who could whisper warnings, about gods who turned greedy men into beetles. These stories weren't just for fun. They were instruction, warning, a way to learn who to trust and what to avoid, a way to feel wonder in a world that left little room for dreaming. With no books, no drawings, no written lessons, stories were survival guides wrapped in imagination. But even the imagination had boundaries. A child might imagine a different day, but not a different life. They might dream of a good harvest or an easier task, but not of escape. There were no what-ifs. There was only what was. Still, laughter happened. Rare, quick, and often hidden, but real. A shared joke whispered in the shadows. A game scratched in the dirt with sticks and pebbles. A splash from the river when no one was watching. A race across a courtyard, barefoot and breathless, until a scolding voice called them back. These were the stolen moments, brief, fragile, and weightless. Because for all the burdens a child carried in ancient Egypt, labor, silence, expectation, they still found ways to float above it, if only for a minute. Not in grand escapes, but in the lightness of a shared glance or a soft chuckle at dusk. A reminder that even in a world shaped by duty, there was still room, however narrow, for being young. Their feet were always bare. No shoes, no sandals, just skin against dust, stone, thorns, and heat. The ground was unforgiving, baked hard by the sun during the day, chilled and cracked at night. Calluses formed early, thick and cracked. Cuts were common. Bruises and burns came with the territory. Infection was a quiet threat, carried in every scrape. But there was no avoiding it. Children walked to fetch water, to gather firewood, to carry messages from one household to another. They walked to the river, to the fields, to neighbors' homes. The ground was simply part of life, painful, constant, and expected. Clothes were minimal, especially for the poor. A simple linen wrap if you had one, reused and rewashed until it was more threadbare than textile, more memory than material. In the hottest months, younger children often went unclothed, not from neglect, but from practicality. Cloth trapped heat. Skin at least could breathe. The sun dictated everything, the length of workdays, the timing of meals, even the rhythm of rest. It pressed down on their backs while they worked and seeped into their bones at night. Even sleep came reluctantly, disturbed by the heat, by insects, by noise. Their bodies were small, but the demands placed on them were not. A child might be expected to carry jars of water, stack bricks, herd goats, collect dung, fan fires, or hold a sibling still during an illness. They were extra hands, extra eyes, and in some cases, the next line of defense against disaster. When grain spoiled, when tools broke, when someone fell sick, children didn't get spared. They got used. Not occasionally. Daily. If a tool was too heavy, you dragged it. If a jar was too wide for your arms, you leaned into it. You learned to use your whole body because strength wasn't optional. It was assumed. There were no allowances for weakness. Tired? Work slower, but don't stop. Hungry? Wait until the next meal if there was one. Sick? Hope for rest, but don't expect it. The pace of survival didn't adjust for smaller bodies. It just moved forward, steady and indifferent. And children learned to keep up or fall behind. Falling behind meant extra eyes on you. It meant reminders, lectures, corrections, some verbal, some not. You learned quickly not to cry unless it was truly necessary. You learned to anticipate what was needed before anyone asked. Injury and exhaustion weren't excuses. They were conditions of life. Cracked heels, sore backs, blistered hands. Even young ones bore the posture of labor. Shoulders slumped, eyes careful, movements efficient. There was no childhood fitness, no luxury of rest. You grew into the shape of effort, day by day. Some adapted, others faded. The ones who couldn't keep pace often disappeared from the records, unnamed, uncounted. There are no statues of them, no scrolls written in their memory. But they were there, in the margins of history, in the shallow graves, in the silences. The space they left behind tells you everything you need to know. There was no such thing as a quiet illness. When a child got sick in ancient Egypt, it was everyone's problem. Families huddled close, hoping the fever would break. Neighbors whispered guesses about spirits, curses, or the water being bad. There were no hospitals, no doctors as we know them. Just ritual, guesswork, and the worn-out remedies of the people around you. Healing was more about faith and habit than precision. And when one child got sick, others often followed. Children were vulnerable. Their bodies, still growing, had to endure heat, parasites, poor sanitation, and overwork. Diarrhea could be deadly. A small wound could become infected and kill. Waterborne diseases from the Nile or irrigation channels spread fast. Bathing in the river, drinking from open jars, eating food handled with unwashed hands. It all made kids easy targets. Food was simple but not always safe. Spoilage wasn't obvious. Grain could mold. Fish could turn quickly in the sun. Meat was rare and risky. And kids who ate what they were given had no say in the matter. The most common cures were hope and ritual. Families tried everything. Incantations written on linen strips, necklaces made of protective beads, figurines buried under thresholds, ash smeared across foreheads, spells recited from memory by parents too tired to believe, but too afraid not to try. They turned to healers, to priests, to relatives who remembered something someone once said. Remedies mixed herbs with honey, oil with incense, mashed garlic with beer. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't, but they were always tried. At night, parents didn't sleep much. They sat beside children, checking their breath, feeling for heat, whispering prayers to gods who were always listening but didn't always answer. There were no medicines to break a fever, no ointments to stop an infection from spreading. All they had was time and proximity. A wet cloth, a cool corner of the house, a palm pressed to a forehead. Grief was quiet. Too many losses made it that way. A baby who died might be buried without a name. A toddler who didn't survive the week might not even be mentioned in the family's records. It wasn't callousness, it was protection. Against hope, against disappointment, against the ache of doing it all again next season. Death was not rare. It was expected. It was something you made space for. The cemeteries tell the story. Small graves, short lifespans, burial goods minimal or absent. The art shows ideal families, but the records, when they exist, suggest a different truth. Children weren't guaranteed. They were borrowed for a year, or 5, or 10, and parents loved them with a caution shaped by knowing how often they lost them. And still, they carried on. The sick child was comforted, cradled, cooled with water, not abandoned, just held close, because that was all you could do. You couldn't fight the Nile or the sun or the spirits, but you could sit beside a fevered child and hope. Hope quietly, hope stubbornly, hope even when you knew better. And sometimes that was enough. Sometimes they pulled through. And the house, just for a moment, felt whole again. Nightfall didn't guarantee rest. Even after the sun slipped behind the palms and the light turned soft and gold, a child's work often wasn't over. Lamps had to be refilled with oil pressed from castor beans. Fire embers needed coaxing back to life so the hearth wouldn't die out overnight. Chickens had to be brought in. Clay jugs of water were covered to keep insects away. In some households, older children stayed up to swat away pests threatening the stored grain, especially rats that crept in from holes near the base of the walls. Others were responsible for keeping infants quiet so a few adults could get uninterrupted rest. Sleep itself came hard. Families slept side by side on mats woven from reeds or flattened straw, spread across packed dirt floors. There were no pillows, just folded cloth or nothing at all. Blankets were thin or shared. In winter, you curled tightly for warmth. In summer, the heat pressed down like a second body. Mosquitoes buzzed in your ears. Gnats hovered. Dust clung to sweaty skin. And sometimes, if you were unlucky, snakes slithered near the walls, quiet and unseen until morning. Rats moved through the dark, bold and fearless. Fear was a background hum. There was no lullaby, no bedtime ritual, just the ache of exhaustion, the kind that settles behind your eyes and presses your limbs into stillness. Most children fell asleep to the soundtrack of life continuing around them. Murmured voices between parents, crackling fires kept alive in clay stoves, the scraping of stone, footsteps pacing the courtyard as someone did one last task before sleep. And the dreams, if they came, weren't always kind. Fear of illness, fear of famine, of punishment, of death, which felt near even when it wasn't named. Some children slept with small clay charms tucked beside them, amulets shaped like animals, miniature gods, protective eyes. A few might have a string of old beads passed down, worn and fragile, tied loosely around a wrist or ankle. Parents whispered protective words, often in breath only. Spells were remembered from grandmothers, repeated quietly. But even magic had its limits. The dark felt longer in those nights. Time moved slow. A shift in the wind, the distant howl of a dog, the creak of a door, all reminders that night was never truly still. Some children dreamed of a better day. Others didn't dream at all. Their minds too tired, their bodies too spent. Morning came fast. Sometimes before the sky even lightened, you were up again. The same sun, the same chores, and maybe, if the household was lucky, the same loaf of yesterday's bread, harder now, but still edible. No breakfast as we know it, just another chance to do what was expected, to keep pace, to survive. And so, another day began, quietly, without question, without pause. In the grand temples of Egypt, rituals unfolded with exacting precision, chanting priests in layers of linen, walls inscribed with the words of gods, painted statues that looked as if they could blink. These were the most sacred spaces in the land. But for most children, temples weren't places of awe or mystery. They were cold, massive, and deeply impersonal. Every corridor echoed. Every doorway was tall enough to make a child feel like they didn't belong. Children who entered temple service rarely did so by choice. They weren't always selected for talent or divine favor. Some were given up to fulfill tax quotas, sent as replacements for labor their families couldn't offer. Others were second or third sons, daughters with no dowry prospects, children quiet enough not to protest. To the temple, they were just bodies, capable, replaceable. They were delivered without fuss, often without farewell, the same way grain was measured or cattle were counted. Once inside, childhood ended. The morning began before light touched the horizon. Ritual washing, hands shivering in cold water, linen robes, stiff from the last wash, sandals if you were lucky. Most walked barefoot, their soles growing thick from stone floors and sharp sand. The first task came quickly: sweeping ash, lighting oil lamps, fetching buckets, carrying offerings. No one explained what it all meant. You learned by repetition. You copied the older boys and girls, watched their movements, mirrored their posture. Silence wasn't encouraged. It was demanded. Older children chanted sacred words they didn't yet understand. Each syllable mattered. Each pause had a purpose. There was no room for error. One misstep in a hymn, and you started again. For those training as scribes, it was a different kind of labor. Long hours bent over a board, reed pens scratching across rough surfaces. The same phrases repeated endlessly until they became muscle memory. Mistakes meant starting over. Ink stained the skin. The smell of oil and dust lingered. There was no praise, only correction. And sometimes the correction was sharp. A cane, a slap, or just the heaviness of being watched constantly. The temple was a machine. Tasks rotated. Children polished statues, wiped down stone altars, stirred incense until the blend was just right. Meals were eaten quickly, in silence, often just flat bread, onions, and water. Rest was short. The next duty always waited. There was no time to dream, no space for imagination. If you smiled too long or wandered too far, someone noticed. The correction would come, sometimes quiet, sometimes swift. Outside, other children played in the dust, even if only for moments between chores. Inside, temple children learned discipline before language, obedience before meaning. Some rose through the ranks, became junior priests, scribes, stewards. But that rise was slow, and many didn't last. When debts were repaid, some children were sent home, older, quieter, changed. Others remained for life, never knowing anything beyond the stone walls and ritual hours. They didn't find divinity in the temple. They didn't find wisdom or safety. They found structure, a rhythm so tightly wound it left no room for softness. The temple didn't offer childhood. It extracted it, line by line, step by step. In the eyes of the gods, the rituals mattered more than the children who performed them. And so, childhood in the temple didn't just end. It was erased. Most children didn't know what year it was. Time wasn't measured by birthdays, holidays, or school calendars. It was measured by seasons, by the slow rising and falling of the Nile, by the planting and harvesting of crops, by the coming of sickness, and the toll of funerals. You knew it was time to plant when the river finally pulled back. You knew someone had died when neighbors wailed outside their home at dawn, when clay pots were broken in mourning, when food was left uneaten. In that world, children grew up surrounded by death, and it wasn't a quiet thing. It was constant and visible. It didn't hide behind closed doors or come in hushed tones. It came loudly with crying and ritual, with dirt and cloth, with silence that lasted long after the ceremony. You saw animals slaughtered for meat and sacrifice. You saw neighbors carried out in woven mats. You saw siblings wrapped in linen and lowered into narrow graves. Death wasn't exceptional. It was part of the cycle. Children didn't get explanations. They got jobs to do. Funerals weren't grand for most families. There were no elaborate tombs, No golden amulets or decorated sarcophagi. Just a few clay jars, maybe some bread, beer, a chant from someone who remembered the right words. Children didn't stand aside to watch. They helped. They fetched water. They swept the floor. They carried offerings. They held silence. Morning didn't offer time to pause. There were still chores waiting. Livestock to feed. Water to carry. Grain to grind. Even grief had to make room for the day's work. You learned early not to ask too many questions. If someone was gone, they were gone. The gods had taken them, or the fever, or a bite from something in the water. Maybe a curse, maybe just bad luck. It didn't matter. Asking why didn't bring anyone back. Asking slowed you down, and if you slowed down, someone else had to pick up your work. So you learned to nod, to accept, to move on. And in the middle of all that, amid the sound of wailing, the smell of smoke, the feel of heat on your back, a child still had to grow, still had to remember the stories they were told, still had to memorize the lines of a prayer, still had to learn to weave reeds, to fish with a net, to bake flatbread over a fire. There was no space to break down, no time for long sadness. You swallowed your grief like yesterday's meal and carried on. You watched the horizon for clouds. You listened to the river. You hoped the flood would be kind next season. To be a child in ancient Egypt was to live with loss pressed into your bones, to watch people leave and learn how to stay. You didn't wait to be brave. You just kept going, because that's what everyone else did. And in that world, survival was the closest thing to peace. They had pets sometimes. Monkeys, dogs, birds, even cats. Especially cats. But owning an animal didn't mean what it means now. Pets weren't companions. They were useful. Cats killed rats. Dogs guarded homes. Monkeys were trained to fetch small items or amuse guests. Birds were raised, eaten, or used in rituals. Every animal had to earn its place. Its value was tied to the work it could do, or the function it served in the household. Sentiment wasn't part of the equation. Children might grow attached to them, might name them, feed them scraps under the table, or even sleep beside them on woven mats. But affection didn't cancel utility. If the household needed meat, the bird disappeared. If a monkey grew too wild, it was tethered tighter or passed off. If a dog bit someone important, it was tied up or gotten rid of. And when a pet died, grief was quiet, private, and short. There were no funeral pyres for pets, no grave markers, just absence, and the quiet adjustment to living without them. There are tomb paintings and fragments of pottery that show children playing with animals, tugging tails, tossing food, laughing at antics. Those are glimpses, not guarantees. Representations of joy, captured not because they were common, but because they were memorable. In daily life, animals were more often tools than companions. The idea of a dog resting its head in a child's lap, unbothered by hunger or duty, that's modern. In ancient Egypt, the dog followed commands or waited in the shade, quiet and alert, because that was its role. Some animals were sacred, but even sacred animals had expectations. Cats were revered for their connection to Bastet, the goddess of home and fertility. But reverence didn't make them exempt from labor. They still chased rodents through storage rooms and barns. Ibises were honored as symbols of wisdom and writing, but they also helped keep vermin in check. Even crocodiles, symbols of Sobek's strength, were kept, fed, and in some cases mummified. Children were taught the layers, reverence and utility. Respect the animal, yes, but never forget what it's for. Still, bonds did form, not in the way we think of today, but in subtle, soft moments. A girl scratching behind a cat's ear while grinding grain. A boy laughing as a monkey snatches a fig and runs. A child whispering secrets to a dog curled in the shade. These were real, but they were layered beneath necessity, and that necessity always came first. Nothing was immune to the hierarchy of usefulness. Even affection had limits. Even love had to yield to survival. A pet could be a companion, but it was always one misstep, one bad season, one shift in fortune away from being reconsidered. And burdens didn't last long in a world where every bite of food, every minute of rest, every bit of space had to be accounted for. There was no room for keeping what didn't contribute. So yes, children in ancient Egypt sometimes had pets. They formed attachments. They laughed, fed, and played when they could. But they also learned early, nothing, no matter how warm or comforting, was safe from being repurposed, reassigned, or removed. Every gesture of affection lived in the shadow of necessity. That was the trade-off. Brief moments of joy, held gently, always aware that the world could take them away at any time. Because in ancient Egypt, even love had a job to do. Not every child made it. That was the unspoken reality behind every lullaby, every carved toy, every whispered prayer at night. The tombs don't show it. The murals paint a world of order and prosperity. But behind the painted walls, in the homes made of sun-baked brick, in the narrow alleys of the village, childhood was shadowed by loss and softened by love that knew how easily it could vanish. Infant mortality was high. Disease was constant and often untreatable. The same Nile that brought life to the land also carried parasites, bacteria, and invisible threats. A fever could take a child in a single night. An infection from a cut, a rash from bad water, a bad cough, these were more dangerous than any wild animal. Malnutrition weakened already fragile bodies, leaving little defense. The diet of the poor lacked diversity, and without enough protein or clean water, many children didn't have a chance to grow strong. There were amulets, rituals, and herbs handed down through generations, things rubbed on the skin, things whispered in the dark. But these weren't cures. They were gestures, acts of hope. And when those hopes failed, mourning was quiet. Families grieved without ceremony. They had to. Life didn't stop for sorrow. A child was gone, but the other siblings still needed feeding. A field needed weeding. A pot needed tending. The cycle of work never paused. The dead were buried with few words, sometimes in reused cloth, sometimes with no marker at all. If the child was very young, they might not even be named in official records. Sometimes they hadn't lived long enough to receive one. Grief was folded into routine. There was no room for collapse. But it lived in small things. In a lullaby sung too softly. In a toy kept long after the child was gone. In the way a mother touched her next newborn with slightly more caution. Loss was woven into the rhythm of life like heat or hunger, present, expected, endured. And still, there was love. Always, there was love. Parents held their children close, not because they could, but because they must. The time might be short, so they sang. They carved toys from scraps of wood and painted shells. They drew gods on bits of pottery to protect the little ones at night. They whispered stories about animals and stars. They taught their children to laugh, even if it was between chores. They told them to be careful with the water, to mind the snakes, to walk in groups. All small ways of saying, stay alive. There are no journals from ancient Egyptian mothers, no bedtime stories written down in their voices, but you can see them in the details, the way a child is tucked into a painted bed in a tomb, the way a small figure is carved with a toy in its hand, the faint remains of finger-painted walls. Love existed, even in fear, especially in fear. To be a child in ancient Egypt was to live in the middle of this quiet tension, loved deeply, but never far from danger. And to be a parent was to hold your child's hand, knowing you might not always get to. So you held on a little tighter, just in case, The concept of rest didn't really apply to children, not the way we understand it. Rest was something that happened only when every chore was done, and even then, it wasn't guaranteed. It was a pause, not a right. A break only earned by silence, obedience, and exhaustion. A child's day began when the light hit the mud brick walls and ended when their body could no longer keep up. There were no naps, unless you collapsed. No quiet time unless the adults demanded it. Stillness was suspicious. Activity was expected. Even play, when it happened, had an undercurrent of preparation. Games mimicked work, not wonder. In the summer heat, work didn't slow. It adapted. Children carried smaller loads, yes, but they carried them farther. They walked to and from the river with heavy jars balanced on aching backs, barefoot across hot, uneven ground. They gathered firewood or dried dung for fuel, brushing off insects and sneezing from the dust. Some swept the floors, others wiped cooking pots with woven reed cloths. In the fields, they scared off birds or pulled weeds until their hands blistered. In the evening, they helped with meals, kneading coarse bread dough, grinding lentils with stone, stirring pots hung over open flame, smoke curling into tired eyes. And then, more water. Always more water. There was always something to clean, to carry, to finish. Some children didn't return from those errands. The water they fetched came from canals where crocodiles waded. The firewood they gathered came from groves where snakes lived. Injury wasn't rare. It was expected. Scrapes turned to infections, bites swelled. Heat stroke didn't announce itself. It crept in slowly under a sky that never softened. But the work didn't stop. Another sibling would be sent. Another jar would be lifted. It was a cycle that continued, unbothered by loss. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and shared. Nights were filled with sound, the rhythmic chorus of insects, the distant bark of dogs, the crackle of a low fire, and murmured voices drifting through shared walls. Children didn't have bedrooms. They had space, a woven mat on the ground, if there was room, a sleeping sibling beside you, a parent's foot near your head. You didn't get a pillow. If you were lucky, you had a carved wooden or clay headrest, rigid and narrow, designed more for posture than for peace. Some children fell asleep sitting up or curled against walls still warm from the day's sun. Dreams didn't factor much into a child's life. No one asked what you wanted to be. No one spoke of futures filled with options or choice. What you were good at became what you did. And if you weren't good at it, you learned. Fast. A mistake wasn't something to reflect on. It was something to avoid repeating. There wasn't room for exploration, only execution. You followed the path laid out in dust and footsteps before you. And if you tried to step outside of that, you were corrected, by hand, by voice, by silence. Fatigue was a companion, not a condition. You learned to work tired. You learned to walk with sore feet, to carry while hungry, to focus while itchy from heat or bites. Your body adjusted, or it didn't, but you didn't stop, because no one else did. Your complaints weren't considered. Whining was met with mockery or punishment. Endurance was praised. Even among children, toughness was admired. The child who didn't cry during punishment, the one who worked through a fever. These were marks of pride. So, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows stretched across the courtyard, the village finally began to quiet. Fires were stoked low, tools were stacked, voices softened, and children sat beside the glow, feet dusty, hands raw, bellies half full, eyes already closing. That was rest. Not escape, not renewal, just a moment where everything paused. A moment long enough to forget the weight of the day, if only briefly. Just enough stillness to make it to the next day, which would begin the same way. Light, chores, heat, noise, a rhythm as old as the Nile and just as unmoved by dreams. You didn't wake to possibilities. You woke to duties. Few children had control over their own time. Hours weren't theirs to fill. They were spoken for. From the moment the first rooster cried to the second, dusk settled across the rooftops. From sunrise to sunset, days followed a routine etched in stone. Tasks repeated. Moments blurred. The world around them moved with purpose, and they were expected to keep up. There was no margin for drifting off or taking your time. Even boredom, if it existed, came with consequences, physical, social, or both. A child might spend the entire day on one task, fetching water from a distant well, gathering reeds along muddy riverbanks, feeding animals in pens made of woven sticks, sweeping dusty courtyards, or squatting over basins, scrubbing clay pots. Each job took time, patience, and repetition. It didn't matter if it was monotonous. It needed to be done. And if you did it wrong, it didn't just reflect on you. It reflected on your family, on your place in the village. Mistakes could mean more than a scolding. They could mean shame. If you spilled the water, someone else would go thirsty. If you left a gate open, animals could escape. If you hesitated too long, you might be replaced by someone smaller, quicker, or more obedient. Nothing was small. Nothing was without weight. There was little room for wandering. Exploration was replaced with obligation. Curiosity was a risk. There were no quiet afternoons to follow a bird's shadow across the field or to lie beside the river watching the clouds. The idea of free time, of choosing how to spend the day, didn't exist for most. You woke with a purpose, and that purpose rarely involved wonder. If you were lucky, there were quiet stretches, moments when the light softened, when no one was calling your name, when you could sit beside a wall and let your feet rest in dust. But those moments were rare, and often interrupted by a voice, a chore, a task you hadn't finished. Quiet was not a reward, it was a delay between demands. Even play was structured. It mirrored the adult world. You played with clay animals because you'd be tending real ones soon. You acted out tasks, not fantasies. There was no pretending to be someone else. You practiced being who you already were. And even these games weren't always yours. Sometimes older siblings handed down expectations in the form of practice. Practice grinding, practice weaving, practice carrying, practice serving. There was no script for dreaming, only rehearsal. Dolls wore real scraps of linen and were sometimes named after family members. Toy boats sailed in puddles only to be snatched back and stored for later use. Everything had a purpose. Nothing was just for fun. As the sun dropped low and the dust settled, the end of the day didn't bring rest. It brought the next round of small responsibilities. Evening fires to tend, feeding animals again, preparing for the next day's grind, rinsing tools, folding cloth, covering jars. If there was a shared meal, it was often quiet, chewed, in silence, with heads down, the day heavy on every pair of shoulders. When the day ended, there wasn't a sense of completion, just the knowledge that tomorrow would be the same river, the same sun, the same steps through the same dust. There was no weekend, no pause, just the long, slow rhythm of survival. Childhood in ancient Egypt didn't have stages. It had repetitions, daily echoes of duty, shaped by sun and dust and expectation. And through those repetitions, you became what was needed, whether you wanted to or not. You didn't grow toward freedom. You settled into a pattern that had no clear beginning and no clean end. Life came fast, quiet, and unrelenting. And you either kept pace or fell behind and were forgotten. Punishment wasn't a last resort. It was part of the rhythm. In homes, in workshops, in temple schools. Discipline was expected, and it was often physical. There were no long talks, about feelings, no careful discussions about behavior. You weren't asked why you did something. You were told not to do it again. A mistake didn't open a conversation. It closed one. Correction came swiftly, sometimes with a sharp word, sometimes with a slap, and often with a cane or a stick kept nearby for just that purpose. The goal wasn't growth. It was obedience. Children weren't expected to understand. They were expected to submit. From the moment you could walk, you were expected to know your place. Children learned quickly that silence was safer than curiosity. A question could be seen as a challenge. Looking too long, speaking out of turn, even fidgeting. These were all seen as signs of disrespect. Most of the time, it was better to stay quiet, stay busy, and stay invisible. Praise came rarely and often only when work was done without flaw. And even then, it was quiet, almost reluctant. There wasn't much room for failure, and even less for second chances. Even in temple schools, where boys trained to become scribes, the discipline was no gentler. These were the lucky few, granted access to knowledge, but it came at a price. The cane was a constant companion. Students recited lines until their throats were dry. They copied hieroglyphs for hours under the glare of a stern instructor. A slip of the reed pen could bring punishment. Memorization mattered more than understanding. You learned what was taught, not why. Writing was a privilege, but it was earned through pain, repetition, and relentless pressure to perform. The classrooms weren't places of encouragement. They were places of endurance. Discipline wasn't just physical. It lived in the air, in the way a parent cleared their throat, in the narrowing of a teacher's eyes. It echoed in silence after a mistake, in the tension before a response. A child could feel the weight of disapproval without a single word being said. There was a rhythm to authority, unspoken but unbreakable. It lived in body language, in tone, in expectation. It shaped how a child stood, how they moved, how they breathed. Every step was watched. Every word was weighed. You learned the rules early, not because they were explained, but because breaking them hurt. And once you learned them, you didn't forget. Discipline wasn't about teaching. It was about molding. Children were shaped like clay, pressed into familiar forms, hardened by repetition. And when that shaping was done, the marks of it remained, not just on the body, but on the way they carried themselves, on the way they avoided eye contact, on the way they lowered their voices when elders were near. It wasn't personal. It was normal. It was everywhere. In ancient Egypt, childhood came with tasks, but it also came with consequences. And every child understood that learning wasn't just about doing things right. It was about not getting caught doing them wrong. They say the Nile gave life, but it also gave rules. For children especially, the river was both a gift and a boundary. It provided fish, water, fertile soil, but it also demanded respect, fear, and labor. You were told to be grateful for the Nile, even as it soaked your feet in mud and pushed work into your small hands. For many, childhood began and ended beside its banks, shaped by its rhythm and warnings. A child might learn to swim before they could walk confidently. Toddlers stumbled on uneven stone paths near the water, splashing in the shallows while their parents worked nearby, always half watching, always too busy. Older siblings were the unofficial guardians, sometimes no more than 6 or 7 themselves. There were no lifeguards, no fences, and the water was never truly safe. It moved gently, but hid everything. Crocodiles that could strike without sound, hippos that were faster than they looked, parasites invisible to the eye but lasting in the body. Still, children were sent to the river each day, to fetch water in jugs bigger than their arms, to wash pots and linens, squatting on slippery rocks, to help with fishing, threading bait, repairing nets, pulling wriggling fish from the muddy shallows. You did what your family needed. There was no choice. The Nile gave, and the Nile took. That was understood. Work near the Nile was constant and unforgiving. Boys helped haul baskets of mud for bricks, smeared with clay and straw beneath the punishing sun. Their backs burned, their hands blistered. Girls waded into water to rinse claws and wash out stains, their legs red from grit and insect bites. Some sat along the edges sorting reeds for weaving, cutting, drying, bundling. Others walked long distances with jars balanced on small heads, returning carefully, always silently, always quickly. These weren't chores. Chores could be missed. These were duties, and duties were not optional. The river didn't just demand work. It taught silence. You didn't complain. You didn't wander. You watched the water and did what you were told. Speaking too loudly could get you scolded. Moving too slowly could get you struck. So you worked with your eyes down, your thoughts quiet. Sometimes in the early hours, or just before sunset, you caught a moment of calm. A ripple, a bird call, the cool brush of wind against your skin. But you didn't stop. You noticed, and you moved on. And through it all, there was a strange kind of reverence, not love, not affection, but respect for something bigger and stronger than you. Behind every task, behind every bucket filled or load carried, there was the knowledge that the Nile was watching, that it had no favorites, that it gave nothing for free, that it remembered nothing and forgave no one. To grow up along its banks was to carry that knowledge in your bones. You learned early that the water flowed with or without your needs. And so you worked, and watched, and obeyed. Because that's what children did. Because that's what the Nile expected. There was no word for teenager in ancient Egypt. You were either a child, or you weren't. The in-between didn't exist. No awkward in-between phase, no period of exploration or self-definition. But the body still changed. Voices deepened, hips widened, limbs stretched. And with those changes came pressure. Quiet, heavy, constant, and inescapable. For girls, it meant being watched more closely. Marriage wasn't a topic of discussion. It was a future already written. Some were promised before their first blood, sealed by family arrangements and quiet exchanges that rarely included them. Once the signs of womanhood arrived, everything shifted. Expectations hardened, tasks doubled. The way people spoke to you changed. The things you were allowed to say and do shrank. Childhood shrank to a shadow replaced by responsibility. Clothing changed, posture changed. You were expected to carry yourself differently. You weren't just watched. You were judged. Girls were taught to be modest, reserved, obedient. Their value was in what they could contribute to a household: labor, children, silence. If they asked too many questions or lingered too long with a friend, eyebrows raised. People remembered. Reputations formed quickly and stuck even faster. For boys, there was no sudden ceremony, just a growing load. They lifted more, worked longer, were expected to know things without being taught. There was no pause, no explanation. A boy who showed hesitation might be mocked, or corrected, or simply left behind. Strength wasn't just physical, it was composure, silence, obedience. You didn't talk about what scared you. You didn't ask for help. You just kept moving, and the world expected you to keep pace. In richer households, boys might study. They might be sent to temple schools to learn reading, writing, and ritual. But even there was no gentleness. Reeds slapped knuckles. Mistakes earned beatings. Lessons were memorized, chanted, repeated, until the mind bent to them. A scribe wasn't born. He was carved, word by word, correction by correction. The idea was to mold, not to nurture. Individuality wasn't a goal. Conformity was. And everywhere, the body was a tool, not a vessel of curiosity or expression, but a thing to use, maintain, and endure. Illness was weakness. Pain was ignored. There were poultices, spells, and charms, but the real expectation was to keep going. You were allowed to fall ill, but not to falter. If you did, someone else had to pick up your load. That wasn't easily forgiven. There was no margin for rebellion, no years of figuring it out. The passage to adulthood wasn't celebrated. It was endured. It came not with gifts, but with tasks, with silence, with pressure. It came with the realization that no one would ask you if you were ready, because readiness didn't matter. Participation did. To grow up in ancient Egypt was to be shaped by pressure, unspoken, relentless, and close. Most never questioned it. They didn't have time to. There were tools to lift, mouths to feed, rituals to follow. And every day, one more piece of childhood slipped away, unnoticed, unspoken, into the dust. The river didn't care how small you were. When it rose too high or sank too low, the burden fell on every set of hands, including the smallest. Children were sent to gather whatever the flood left behind: driftwood for fires, mud for bricks, clay pots half buried in silt, palm leaves for shade or fuel, sometimes even carcasses of drowned animals dragged from the edges of the water and burned before the smell could spread. The Nile was generous, but it could be cruel, and children learned that long before they had the words to describe it. If the harvest failed, it wasn't the scribes who starved first. It was the ones too young to understand why the bread was thinner, the work longer, and the silence heavier. Hunger didn't make speeches. It crept into bellies and slowed legs. It made water taste like ash, and sleep feel like something earned, not given. You learned quickly that if your hands didn't carry something useful, your presence might not be welcomed. And so children adapted. Fast. They became scavengers, helpers, carriers of water and wood. During lean times, even the meager comforts of childhood vanished. Toys were forgotten, stories shortened, laughter thinned out like the soup. Hunger made everything harder: walking, lifting, focusing. It made tempers shorter and nights longer. There was no room for play when calories were counted. For many, the first memory of real fear wasn't a snake or a nightmare. It was the way adults whispered when they thought you weren't listening, the way mothers stopped talking about next week, the way fathers stared at empty baskets, the way older siblings suddenly grew quiet and serious. You could feel it in the air before it was ever explained. Sometimes, hunger came with movement. Families leaving home, walking toward places rumored to have more grain, better water, a temple storing reserves. Sometimes they came back. Sometimes they didn't. And children watched all of this, silently absorbing it. They learned what to pack, how to wait, how to carry their own weight. Even if they barely filled the shadow of an adult, they learned how to listen without asking questions, how to spot a silent warning in a parent's eyes, how to brace for disappointment before the words came. Sometimes, hunger created ghosts. Not the kind that haunted tombs, but the kind that lingered in empty beds and missing voices. A friend gone, a sibling buried before the harvest came. These losses weren't spoken about loudly. They were folded into the rhythm of survival. Just another thing you learned to carry. If you asked too many questions, you got a quiet look. If you cried too loudly, someone told you to hush. Grief was allowed, but only in small doses, like everything else. And when food came back, it didn't erase the memory. It lingered in habits. Kids learned early to take nothing for granted, to eat when food was in front of you, to hoard crumbs, to keep an eye on the grain jar, to never trust a full table too completely. Scarcity became normal. Even when stomachs were full, the tension remained, as if the next famine had already started, just out of sight. Joy was approached cautiously, like a dog that might bite. You smiled, but not too wide. You laughed, but kept one eye open. So they worked harder, slept lighter, grew up faster. Joy came in small doses, if at all. A bite of fruit, a meal uninterrupted, a quiet evening where no one spoke of the flood, the luxury of silence without worry, a day when no one mentioned the gods, or the grain, or the river's next rise, not because anyone told them to, but because the river had already taught them how, and they listened, and they remembered, even when no one asked them to. There were no diaries, no journals, no crayon drawings pinned to walls or names scrawled into the corners of doorframes. If a child had thoughts, dreams, or fears, they were rarely spoken aloud, let alone written down. The past, as we know it, was carved and painted and remembered by adults. And children, unless they were royal, exceptional, or marked by tragedy, vanished into the margins of memory. We piece together their lives through fragments, tiny sandals hardened by time, broken clay dolls with faded paint, miniature pots that once held water or grain. We find child-sized tools, worn smooth by small hands. We find amulets shaped like frogs or cats, tucked near ribs in tiny graves. In tomb paintings, children appear only briefly, always smaller than scale, clinging to a parent's leg, holding a bird, playing a flute. Even these depictions were not reflections of daily life, but carefully arranged symbols, part of a narrative the adults wanted remembered. What those children actually felt, what they feared at night, what they longed for in the quiet. Those truths are gone. Most children didn't leave a legacy in stone. They left their mark in softer ways. A groove in the doorway, where their shoulder brushed day after day. A worn patch on a mat, where they slept. A thumbprint fired into a brick by accident. Their lives were absorbed by the ordinary, by chores, by heat, by dust. When they died, and many did, it was quiet. No procession, no priest, no inscription, just a hastily dug grave at the edge of a village, a little linen wrapping, a bead tied around the wrist, maybe two if the family had enough to spare. The same hands that once braided their hair now pressed their body into stillness. And yet they mattered. They mattered deeply. They carried water from the river. They fed chickens, ground grain, cleaned ash from the hearth. They fetched reeds, repaired mats, held babies so their mothers could work. Their hands helped build the base of the world their elders ruled. Without them, the rhythm of Egypt, the daily pulse of labor and rest, heat and harvest, would have faltered. They were the invisible gears in a massive, grinding machine, always moving, always essential, rarely seen. We remember the kings and the generals, the scribes and the high priests. Their names were carved into stone. But the children? They held everything together. They did what they were told. They stood in the heat. They worked until their backs ached. And then they disappeared. Not just from history books, but from memory. And still, in the quiet corners of ancient ruins, we find them. Not in statues, but in fingerprints. Not in monuments, but in the worn-out paths they walked. The past didn't record their voices, but it remembers their weight. They didn't have birthdays, not in the way we imagine them. No cakes, no candles, no decorations, no parties with games and laughter. In fact, most children didn't even know the exact day they were born. Time was measured differently by floods, harvests, planting seasons, and religious festivals. The annual rise of the Nile, the day a sibling was born, or the moment a new pharaoh took the throne. These were the reference points. A child wasn't counted in years, but in what they could do. Could they carry water? Could they sweep the floor with care? Could they weave mats without needing correction? Could they be trusted to watch a younger sibling and keep them safe? That's how age was noticed. Not with numbers, but with tasks. The idea of marking each year of life with joy and reflection simply didn't exist. Time moved in cycles, not milestones. The flood season, the planting season, the harvest, the dry months, these were the calendar. For most families, the rhythm of survival left little room for sentiment. Life was too uncertain, too fragile. Children were expected to adapt to the needs of the household as soon as they could stand upright and carry weight. There were no pauses to look back, no framing of progress with candles or cake. You became more valuable when you became more useful, not older. Celebration came rarely, and when it did, it was almost never for children. If there was a feast, it was for the gods, or for a king's coronation, or maybe to mark the completion of a new building or a good harvest. The family might eat together, and a child might get a taste of something sweet or a piece of bread baked with honey, but they weren't the reason for the occasion. Their joy came second, often unnoticed, and never planned for. Childhood wasn't a chapter to be celebrated. It was a period of preparation, a test, a time to prove that you could contribute, that you were worth investing time and effort into. Every task completed without complaint was a small step toward trust, and every mistake a reminder of how little space there was for failure. There were milestones, though. Not birthdays, but changes in responsibility. A girl learning to spin thread without tangling it. A boy casting a net for the first time and bringing back fish. A child learning to recite a hymn correctly during a temple visit. These were the events that mattered, and they went mostly unspoken. But they didn't go unnoticed. A nod from an elder, a rare smile, maybe a pat on the shoulder or a shift in chores that meant more trust. These subtle signs were the markers of progress, quiet affirmations that you were becoming useful, that you belonged, that you were stepping into your place, as expected. There was no fanfare, no reward, just the gradual accumulation of labor, day by day. And in a world where death was common and childhood was brief, making it to another year wasn't marked with balloons. It was marked by survival, avoiding infection, withstanding heat, not getting bitten by something in the river, dodging injury, staying quiet when tempers flared, knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. The unspoken victories of staying alive in a dangerous, uncertain world. Illness came often and passed quickly. If you recovered, you returned to your chores. If you didn't, your name was whispered and buried, and life went on. Few families could afford extended grief. There were other mouths to feed, other children to raise, and still the Nile kept moving. No songs, no gifts, no crowns made of paper or candles blown out with wishes. Just another day in the sun, doing what had to be done. Maybe if you worked hard enough, someone would trust you with a new job. Maybe not. Either way, the Nile still rose, the chores still waited, and the village moved on. Childhood didn't stop for reflection. It moved forward without fanfare, one long, steady walk toward adulthood, whether you were ready or not, whether anyone noticed or not. The gods were everywhere, and children grew up learning their names before they fully understood their own. Not just the great ones, Ra, Osiris, Isis, but the quieter guardians too, Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess who watched over pregnant women, Bes, the squat lion-faced dwarf who made funny faces to chase away nightmares, Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe who saw everything and forgot nothing. To be a child in ancient Egypt was to sleep under the gaze of 100 spirits, each one powerful, each one personal. Myth wasn't a story, it was the furniture of life. It was etched into the walls of your house, painted on your toys, murmured in the songs your mother hummed while working. Gods were everywhere, watching, judging, protecting, punishing. You might stumble over a crack in the earth and wonder if it was the result of a forgotten offering. You might fall ill and hear your parents speak of demons or curses, never germs, never chance. But the gods were not gentle. They demanded offerings. They needed appeasement. A sick child was never just a sick child. It was a sign. Something had been missed. Something had gone wrong. Maybe a prayer was skipped. Maybe a charm was broken. Children were bundled in protections, strings of faience beads, carved amulets shaped like eyes, ankhs, frogs, scarabs. Tiny figures tucked under tunics, hidden in bedding, buried in thresholds. Magic was part of the wardrobe. Mothers whispered to the gods before nursing, tracing symbols on the skin of their babies. Fathers left scraps of food at altars or whispered thanks after each safe night. Sickness meant ritual. Prayers. Incantations written on linen and tied to wrists. Sometimes a healer was called, a priest, a magician, who mixed medicine with words, who smoked the room with incense, read the stars, called on names older than memory. Temples echoed with chants, but the real prayers happened at home, in courtyards where children played under the dust, in kitchens where food spoiled too fast and the air grew heavy with heat and hope. When a child cried through the night, it wasn't just worry. It was fear of unseen things. When someone vanished beneath the flood, people asked not what happened, but who was angry. Children didn't just observe religion, they lived inside it. Every sneeze, every cough, every recovery was filtered through belief. When your fever broke, it wasn't the body healing. It was a God showing mercy. When a wound closed, someone had listened. Faith wasn't abstract. It wasn't a choice. It was woven into the muscle memory of survival. And through it all, the weight of fear lingered. Not the fear of divine wrath in the theatrical sense, but of something worse. The fear of divine silence. The gods might look away. They might be tired of your voice. They might not see you. And in a world where danger came quietly and often, from water, from heat, from illness, from fate, the only protection was belief that someone larger than you was paying attention, even if sometimes they weren't. The games children played weren't always games. They mimicked adult tasks: hauling, grinding, shaping, copying. Play was rehearsal. A boy might crouch in the dust with a twig as his staff, pretending to herd imaginary goats, or chase after an older sibling with exaggerated determination, like a laborer chasing a task overdue. A girl might shape tiny mud loaves and pretend to line them up in a row just as her mother did each morning. Another would twist reeds into thread, copying fingers that spun without pause. These weren't acts of fantasy. They were previews, a dry run for responsibility. The objects they used were often discarded scraps, bits of wood carved into animals, pieces of broken pottery turned into dolls, seed pods turned into rattles or beads. A shard of limestone might become a slate. A lump of clay became whatever was missing. Nothing was wasted. Everything had potential. Even toys served a purpose: to train, to occupy, to prepare. A child's imagination didn't lead to castles or clouds. It stayed tethered to routine, rooted in the motions of survival. Pretend was never far from practice, and yet, in the narrow cracks of that structure, there was creativity. Songs whispered between chores, old melodies barely remembered but still sung. Voices rose and fell while hauling baskets or sweeping floors. Riddles passed from child to child. Riddles about birds and gods, insects and food, folded into breathless laughter. Shadow shapes danced on mud brick walls as the sun angled low. Some children learned to carve basic shapes into bits of wood or bone, to shape clay into beads, to copy glyphs with sticks in the sand, imagining not a better world, but a place in this one. Not dreams of escape, but dreams of skill. Play was a pause, brief, fragile, never guaranteed. Some children learned to catch lizards, to mimic animal sounds, to stack stones into tiny towers, then watch them fall. Others played stick games, counting rhythms, or drew maze-like paths in the dirt for insects. A piece of broken jar could become a boat in a puddle. 2 pebbles became a race. The simplest things carried meaning, because the world allowed so little extra. But always, the adults watched. Play was permitted, but conditionally. It had to stay within bounds, never interrupt the work, never cause a mess, never cost anything. The moment it crossed into distraction, it stopped being innocent. A laughing child might be hushed with a sharp word, a game cut short with a snapped name or a glance that meant the joy was over. A wandering child was pulled back to the task, reminded of their place. Joy had boundaries. Imagination had a curfew. Still, there was beauty in that constraint. In the quiet way children built little worlds inside narrow margins. In the way they sang while working, made games out of sorting stones, turned chores into contests. They measured time in handfuls of grain or shadows on the floor. They made space for themselves in the cracks, between tasks, beneath expectations, behind the eyes of watchful adults. Small moments became entire afternoons when stretched by the right kind of focus. Because in ancient Egypt, even the youngest were expected to understand this. Life was about contribution. Childhood was about becoming useful. You weren't raised to wonder who you'd be. You were raised to become what was needed. And play, when allowed, was only ever a brief echo of what waited just beyond it. A rehearsal not just for work, but for structure, silence, and the understanding that time, even yours, belonged to someone else. Not every child in ancient Egypt lived among the crops and animals of the countryside. Some opened their eyes each morning to the rattle of traders, the chanting of temple rituals, and the uneven rhythm of sandals scraping against stone. These were the children of crowded towns, of dusty alleyways and temple districts, where every spare corner held a pot, a goat, a vendor, or another person. Life in the cities didn't move with the seasons. It moved with noise, with footsteps, with obligation. In these busy pockets of Egypt, children had no slow starts. From the time they could walk, they were sent on errands, tasked with deliveries, expected to remember. There were no backpacks, just small hands gripping baskets or jars, navigating narrow lanes packed with animals, carts, and grown-ups who didn't have time to explain. They fetched water from communal wells, sometimes waiting for hours in line, jostled by older kids or snapped at by adults. They carried linen to dyers, bread to market stalls, and messages between homes. Many had their own mental maps of side routes and shortcuts long before they ever held a stylus. Getting lost was not an option. The city didn't pause for confusion. Temple districts added a second layer of intensity. If your family worked near or within these sacred spaces, every movement mattered. The temples weren't just places of worship. They were institutions. They owned land, employed workers, managed food stores. Children of temple workers learned rules early: silence near sanctuaries, stillness during rituals, cleanliness at all costs. A dropped jar, a loud voice, a dirty hand, any of these could bring trouble. Sometimes it meant more than just scolding. In sacred places, mistakes were often seen as spiritual failings, and children bore the weight of that pressure. Education existed, but it wasn't about freedom. It was about precision. In temple schools, boys memorized hymns, copied signs over and over, stood for hours chanting lines with reed pens in their fingers and sore legs beneath them. Girls were taught less formally, usually within the home, but with equal expectation. To live near the gods was not a privilege. It was a burden of behavior, of correctness, of constant attention. Children learned by watching the tilt of a priest's hand, the way a scribe walked, the small signs that warned you to stay back or bow lower. Even outside the temples, the city was a training ground. Children learned to read mood, to spot danger, to know which adults were kind and which were best avoided. There was no structured playtime, no safe zone. Any free moment was fleeting. Sometimes laughter slipped through, a game of stones in the dust, a mock argument with a friend, a story passed between siblings. But even play was practical. Toys were few and simple. Joy had to be fast, and it had to be quiet. Food, even in the city, was humble. Meals were short, and often shared standing up. Illness came fast and spread faster. Flies, waste, and heat made every scrape risky. The air was filled with noise and dust, and the sharp awareness that childhood here, like everywhere else in Egypt, was on a timer. You didn't grow into adulthood. You were folded into it, shaped by stone walls, temple rules, and the fast-moving current of life that never slowed down. The city moved and children moved with it. Hesitate, and you'd be left behind. Even for those who survived the gauntlet of childhood, the weight didn't lift. It simply shifted. By the time a child reached what we would call adolescence, they had already seen enough loss, endured enough labor, and swallowed enough dust to age them beyond their years. It wasn't uncommon for someone to carry the same duties at 15 that they would carry at 40. And there was no roadmap for this change. No conversation, no acknowledgement. It just happened. Quietly. Permanently. There were no rites of passage. No ceremony to recognize the moment. You just stopped being seen as a child. And that was it. These were the years when a child was expected to fully disappear into their role. The village stopped seeing them as young. They became part of the labor structure, part of the household function. The family expected more without saying it. You were entrusted with tools, responsibilities, siblings. You were expected to know. You didn't ask for rest. You didn't ask for help. You learned to do what was needed, quietly. Competence became the only language that mattered. Mistakes weren't seen as growth. They were seen as risk, and risk wasn't tolerated. Some became parents themselves before they were truly grown. Others took on the full load of family duty if an elder died or became ill. And if grief came, it wasn't discussed. It was worn like a layer of dust, always present, never acknowledged. Children learned to keep their sorrow silent, folding it into their work, tucking it into the corners of their day. There was no space to mourn out loud. Tears dried faster than they fell. There were too many tasks, too many mouths to feed. Emotions, like dreams, were indulgences few could afford. Relief was rare. There were no holidays from expectation, no afternoons off. Joy came in flickers, a quiet conversation, a successful harvest, a moment of peace when the river ran high and the granaries were full. Even then, the memory of lean years lingered. It haunted every full bowl of grain, every satisfied sigh. Children who had gone hungry didn't forget. They carried the anxiety into their adult years, always bracing for the next shortfall. They didn't relax. They paused, just long enough to catch their breath before the next demand arrived. For some, these adolescent years brought a narrowing of vision. Dreams became practical. Hopes became habits. You learned to lower your gaze, to measure the day not in wishes but in chores completed. You did not rebel. You adapted. The social framework allowed little room for deviation. Every child knew someone who had stepped out of line, and what happened to them was never framed as heroic. Stories were told as warnings, not inspiration. You knew better than to want something different. Even friendships changed. Childhood bonds, once formed around play and shared chores, became strained by expectation. There was less time to talk, less space to laugh. You started to see others not as companions, but as fellow laborers, or sometimes competition, for resources, for approval, for survival. Affection remained, but it wore new clothes, quieter, smaller, and always aware of its limits. By now they weren't really children anymore, not in the way we think of childhood. They were shaped by fire and river and repetition. They knew what was expected. They didn't ask questions. They simply became what they had to be. and they wore that role with the same resigned dignity their parents had worn. There was no reward for resistance. There was only survival. And survival was its own kind of inheritance, passed down like a tool with no sheath. And in that transformation, something quietly vanished. Not innocence. That was gone early. But something even harder to define. The space to imagine anything different. The room to ask, what if? Instead, they learned to say, this is how it is, and carry on. The dreaming parts of them, the ones that might have wandered, stayed quiet. Not because they were silenced, but because they were never allowed to speak.